The night sky above Moscow turned orange. Not from sunrise, it was barely past midnight, but from the rolling fireballs punching into the city's skyline from every direction at once. 3 years of war, 3 years of Vladimir Putin telling his people that the front was safely somewhere far away, somewhere east, somewhere that wasn't their streets, wasn't their refinery, wasn't the semiconductor plant quietly building the brains of his missiles. 3 years of that comfortable lie. And then the night of May 16th arrived, and the lie burned with everything else. Over 500 Ukrainian drones were in the air simultaneously, boring through the darkness toward the Russian heartland, and more than 80 of them weren't stopping at the border regions. They weren't stopping at the suburbs. They were heading directly for the Russian capital, the most heavily defended airspace on the European continent, and they were going to make it through. This wasn't a harassment strike. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. This was Ukraine announcing, in fire and wreckage, that the rules of this war had permanently changed. So how on earth did they do it? Let's start with what Moscow's air defense was supposed to be. Because understanding how Ukraine cracked it open requires understanding why everyone, including many Western military analysts, assumed it couldn't be cracked. The Russian capital sat at the center of what the military community describes as a layered, redundant air defense architecture. Think of it as concentric rings of death radiating outward from the Kremlin. The outermost ring, stretching hundreds of kilometers, was anchored by S-400 Triumph batteries, arguably the most sophisticated long-range surface-to-air missile system in the Russian arsenal, capable of engaging targets at extreme altitudes and distances. Inside that, filling the mid-range gaps, sat Pantsir S-1 gun missile systems, rapid-fire death machines designed specifically to kill the kind of small, and layered through all of it, like a nervous system, was an aggressive electronic warfare network. GPS jamming stations running from Podolsk to Sergeyev Posad, designed to scramble the navigation systems of any incoming drone and send it spiraling harmlessly into a field. On paper, Moscow's airspace was impenetrable. On paper. Because what the Russian defense establishment fundamentally failed to account for was a Ukrainian military that had spent months quietly and methodically studying every single gap in that system, every blind spot, every overloaded node, every place where the rings didn't quite overlap. Weeks before the first drone crossed into Moscow Oblast, Ukrainian intelligence and long-range strike teams began a systematic, almost surgical campaign against Russian radar installations and air defense units positioned between 20 and 200 kilometers from the contact line. This wasn't random shelling. This was deliberate, targeted suppression of specific sensor nodes, the electronic eyes that feed data into Moscow's integrated defense network. Radar by radar, tracking station by tracking station. Ukraine was quietly carving what military planners call blind corridors, directly into the Russian early warning grid. By the time these corridors were punched through, there were stretches of the Russian radar network that were effectively looking at static. And Ukraine knew exactly where those stretches were. Then came the main event, and this is where the operational genius of the strike becomes truly apparent. Because what Ukraine deployed on the night of May 16th wasn't just a mass swarm of identical drones. It was a layered, choreographed deception operation conducted at industrial scale. Leading the charge were hundreds of low-cost, jet-powered decoy platforms, the RS-1 bars, howling through the night at speeds and radar signatures specifically calibrated to mimic large incoming cruise missiles. The Russian air defense network, seeing what looked like an enormous, high-priority missile assault bearing down on the capital, did exactly what it was programmed to do. It engaged. Battery after battery lit up. S-400 interceptors burned off their launch rails. Pantsir systems swiveled and fired. The Russians threw their expensive, irreplaceable interceptor missiles at a wave of cheap decoys. And slipping in directly behind that wave, threading through the exhausted and now partially depleted defense grid, came Ukraine's new generation of long-range stealth platforms, the Firepoint FP1 and the Bars SM Gladiator. These were domestically engineered EW-resistant systems built with advanced internal navigation that doesn't rely on GPS at all. The Kremlin's jamming stations, meant to be Moscow's electronic immune system, had nothing to lock onto. The Gladiators flew straight and true. The capital's outer defenses, already burning through their stocks against decoys, couldn't stop them all. The corridors were open, the interceptors were spent, and 500 drones were inside Russian airspace. Now let's talk about what they hit, because this is where the strike transforms from an impressive military achievement into a genuine strategic earthquake. The first, and perhaps most immediately dramatic impact, was at the Kapotnya oil refinery, a massive industrial complex sitting inside the Moscow metropolitan area that serves as a primary fuel supply hub for the capital and its surrounding infrastructure. Kapotnya went up in spectacular fashion. Massive fires, workers injured in the initial explosions, operations suspended. A critical artery in Moscow's fuel supply chain suddenly choked. But Ukraine wasn't done there. Simultaneously, precision systems peeled off toward the Solnekhnogorskaya and Volodarskoye oil pumping stations, two key nodes in the Ring pipeline network that feeds not just civilian infrastructure, but the regional military logistics chain. Think about what a pipeline ring means for a moment. It's not a single pipe you can reroute around. It's an interconnected loop. Disrupt it at multiple points simultaneously, and the disruption multiplies exponentially. Ukraine hit multiple points simultaneously. And then there was Zelenograd, a name that most Muscovites don't associate with the war at all. A quiet techno-industrial suburb sitting northwest of the capital, known since the Soviet era as Russia's answer to Silicon Valley. Inside Zelenograd, the Angstrom plant had been quietly humming away under heavy international sanctions, producing the semiconductors and microchips and advanced robotics components that feed directly into Russia's high-precision weapons programs. The missiles, the guided bombs, the navigation systems on the very drones Russia launches every single night at Ukrainian cities. The Angstrom plant was, in a very literal sense, a factory producing the instruments of civilian murder. A Ukrainian drone found it. The plant took a direct hit. Explosion. Structural damage. The brains of Russia's precision weapons program, sitting on a workbench in suburban Moscow, catching fire. Again, we see the pieces of the puzzle coming together. This was not random. Every single target in this strike was chosen with ruthless, deliberate logic. Hit the fuel supply. Hit the fuel distribution. Hit the weapons manufacturing. Methodically dismantle the infrastructure that keeps the Russian war machine running. And do it inside the bubble that Putin's propaganda operation has spent 3 years telling Russians is untouchable. But here is where this story gets serious. And I mean genuinely, structurally serious. Because the military damage, as significant as it is, might actually be the least important consequence of what happened on the night of May 16th. While explosions were rocking the capital, while fireballs were visible across multiple districts, while residents of Lefortovo and other neighborhoods were scrambling for shelter, Russia's state television was broadcasting its regular programming. Morning bulletins offered brief, dismissive mentions of successful interceptions and foiled Ukrainian provocations. Typical Moscow. Claiming interceptions while your refinery burns and your microchip plant smokes. But here is what the Kremlin could not control. The Telegram channels. The social media posts already shared thousands of times before the censors could scrub them. Ordinary Muscovites, furious and terrified, posting videos of the night sky lit up like a festival, asking where the air raid sirens were, because there weren't any, asking why metro stations, Lefortovo cited by name again and again, were locked shut in the middle of an active attack, leaving residents with nowhere to shelter from falling debris. Spoiler alert, nothing was fine. And the pro-war military blogging community, typically the most loyal amplifiers of Kremlin narratives, turned on the government with open contempt. How, they demanded, does a self-proclaimed nuclear superpower, a country that spends fortunes maintaining the fiction of unassailable military dominance, allow enemy drones to reach its capital in mass formation? There was no good answer. And Putin knew there was no good answer, which is why his government's immediate response was not an improved air defense posture or a public accountability hearing. It was a legislative ban. Overnight, the Kremlin moved to criminalize the publication of any smartphone footage showing drone strikes or active air defense operations on Russian soil. Think about that for a moment. The Russian government's first priority, in the immediate aftermath of the largest aerial assault on Moscow since the Second World War, was not to protect its citizens, to slam a curtain down over the image of their burning capital before that image could fully calcify in the Russian public consciousness. That curtain came about 3 hours too late. And this brings us to the trap. The catch. 22. That is slowly, systematically strangling Vladimir Putin's strategic position. Because the success of this strike doesn't just expose a military gap, it exposes a political death zone with no exit. Consider the position Putin now inhabits. The ideology that has justified 3 years of brutal, grinding war, that has sustained public support through sanctions and body bags and economic pain, is built on a specific foundational promise. That promise is that Russians are safe, that the suffering happens to other people, to Ukrainians, to enemies, not to Muscovites, not in the capital, not on the streets where Putin's political base actually lives. That promise just burned with the Kapotnia refinery. So what does he do? If he escalates further, launches heavier missile barrages, intensifies the ground offensive, reaches for even more destructive tools, he risks provoking an even larger and more sophisticated Ukrainian response against Russian territory, one that penetrates the capital again and again. Each strike that reaches Moscow erodes the foundational myth of domestic safety further. His own population begins to understand at a gut level what a losing war actually looks like. But if he pulls back, if he de-escalates, if he signals any willingness to negotiate, he has to explain to every hardline nationalist, every pro-war blogger who spent the morning screaming about the incompetence of Moscow's air, he has to sell a ceasefire against the backdrop of a burning oil refinery 3 miles from the Kremlin. If he fights, the strikes intensify. If he deals, the myth collapses. Either path forward leads through the same chasm. Either way, he loses the story. And in a system built entirely on managed perception, losing the story is losing the war. The question that the Kremlin has spent years making unspeakable, what is all of this actually for, is now being asked openly in the comments of state media posts and the Telegram feeds of the very bloggers the government depends on to shape opinion. The answer to that question, as it has been for quite some time, stares Vladimir Putin in the face every morning he looks in the mirror. And May 16th made sure a great many more Russians are starting to ask it too. Ukraine's domestic drone capability has reached an inflection point, a place where technological adaptability and mass industrial output can absorb Russian escalation and answer it directly over Moscow itself. The psychological reality of this war has shifted permanently, not at some contested village on the front line, in the capital, in the burning refinery, in the shattered semiconductor plant that was supposed to be quietly building the future of Russian precision warfare. If you want to understand what comes next, and there is already a next chapter taking shape, make sure you are subscribed and hit the bell, because this escalation cycle is not over. It has barely begun.